In the unforgiving dust of the Texas frontier, a single act of mercy can cost a woman everything she has: her home, her name, her place in the world. For Sarah Jane Miller, a woman already living on the fringes of society, the choice to save a life that others wanted to end was no choice at all. It was instinct. But she never knew that the bleeding Comanche warrior she hid beneath her floorboards was destined for greatness, or that the debt he owed would be called due, not with gold or horses, but with her. This is the story of a secret that forged a destiny and a claim that would challenge the very soul of the West. The sun over Redemption Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1871 was a merciless, molten hammer. It beat down on the parched earth, cracking it into a web of thirsty fissures, and bleached the very life from the landscape. For Sarah Jane Miller, it was just another day of wresting a living from her late husband's stubborn plot of land. At 28, her hands were calloused, her face prematurely lined by worry and weather, and her spirit, while not broken, was profoundly lonely. Daniel had been gone for 2 years, taken by a fever that swept through the valley like a phantom thief. His passing had left Sarah in a precarious position. A widow with no children, she was an anomaly, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of the frontier settlement. The townfolk were polite enough, but a current of suspicion and pity followed her. The women whispered about her independence, and the men like Deputy Elias Thorne watched her with a proprietary mixture of concern and contempt. Thorne, a man whose righteousness was as rigid as the star pinned to his chest, made a point of riding out to Miller's Creek once a week. He said it was to ensure her welfare. But Sarah knew he was checking to see if she had failed, yet if she was finally ready to sell her land for a pittance and move into town as a laundress or a seamstress. On this particular afternoon, the air was thick with more than just heat. A posse led by Thorne himself had thundered past her property that morning. Their horses kicked up a storm of red dust, and their shouts carried on the wind, ugly words of pursuit and vengeance. A small party of Comanche hunters had allegedly broken the unspoken boundary of the Brazos River, and a calf had been found killed on the Abernathy Ranch. It was all the excuse men like Thorne needed. Sarah had paid them no mind, focusing on patching the roof of her small, sodden timber cabin. But as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, a sound from the creek bed behind her house made her freeze her hammer, poised in mid-air. It wasn't the gentle rustle of a rabbit or the scuttling of an armadillo. It was the ragged, desperate gasp of a man in agony. Her first instinct was fear. Daniel had taught her how to use his old Winchester, and she kept it loaded above the hearth. She grabbed the rifle, its familiar weight, a cold comfort in her hands, and crept towards the stand of cottonwoods that lined the dying creek. There, half submerged in the muddy trickle of water, was a man. He was Comanche. His bare chest was slick with a terrifying amount of blood, a dark stain blossoming from a gruesome wound in his side. A shattered arrow shaft protruded from his shoulder, and his legislative breeches were torn and soaked. But it was his face that stopped her. Even contorted in pain, it held a fierce, unbroken pride. His black hair was matted with sweat and dirt, but his eyes, when they flickered open and met hers, burned with a defiant fire that seemed to challenge the very notion of death. The posse's shouts echoed faintly in the distance. They were still searching. To turn him in would be the sensible, safe thing to do. It would earn her a nod of approval from Deputy Thorne, perhaps even a moment of acceptance in the town. To help him would be to invite disaster, to risk being branded a traitor, an Indian lover. It could cost her everything. He tried to push himself up, a low groan escaping his lips before collapsing back into the water. In that moment, he was not a warrior, not an enemy. He was just a young man bleeding out in a creek bed miles from his people. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of indecision. She thought of Daniel, how she had nursed him through his fever, helpless, as his life slipped away. She thought of the cold judging the eyes of the townspeople. Then she looked at the warrior, at the raw will to live burning in his gaze. "Damn it all to hell," she whispered to the unforgiving sky. Lowering the Winchester, she waded into the creek. The warrior's eyes widened, his hand instinctively reaching for a knife that wasn't there. He tensed, expecting a bullet. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice soft but firm, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, only the tone. "But you can't stay here. They'll find you." She gestured towards the direction of the posse, then back to her cabin. He watched her, his expression a mask of suspicion and pain. It took every ounce of her courage to reach out and touch his uninjured arm. His skin was hot with fever. He flinched but didn't pull away. With immense effort she helped him to his feet. He was taller than she'd realized, lean but powerfully built. He leaned heavily on her, his breath coming in ragged, painful hitches. Every step from the creek to the cabin was an ordeal. He left a trail of bloodied footprints in the dust, a damning line of evidence she would have to erase. She guided him not through the front door, but around to the back, to the heavy wooden door of the root cellar set into the earth. With her heart in her throat, she opened it, revealing the cool, dark space below. The smell of damp earth and stored potatoes rose to meet them. "In here," she urged, guiding him down the rickety steps. "It's the only place." He collapsed onto a pile of burlap sacks in the corner, his brief surge of strength gone. His eyes fluttered, then closed. For a terrifying moment, she thought he had died, but then she saw the faint rise and fall of his chest. Sarah Jane Miller stood in the gloom of her cellar, the dying light of a Texas sunset filtering through the cracks in the door, and stared at the unconscious man she had just made her secret. She was no longer just a lonely widow. She was a conspirator, a harborer of a fugitive. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her life, the simple, hard, lonely life she knew was over. The debt for this act of mercy was yet to be tallied, but the bill would surely come due. For the next 10 days, Sarah's world shrank to the size of her cabin and the dark, earthen-smelling root cellar. The warrior, she still didn't know his name, drifted in and out of consciousness, his body consumed by a raging fever. She became a creature of secrecy and shadow, her every action dictated by the dangerous secret she kept. By the dim light of a single lantern, she performed a brutal frontier surgery. She broke off the arrow shaft, her stomach churning at his strangled cry of pain, and used Daniel's sterilized pliers to pull the arrowhead from the muscle of his shoulder. The bullet wound in his side was worse, ragged and inflamed. She cleaned it as best she could with boiled water and whiskey, the only antiseptic she had, and packed it with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey leaves, remedies her grandmother had taught her. She tore strips from her own meager supply of linens for bandages, changing them twice a day. Each time she had to support his heavy frame, her face inches from his, feeling the searing heat radiating from his skin. In his delirium, he would sometimes murmur in a language that was all harsh consonants and soft vowels, his hands clenching into fists as if fighting off unseen demons. In those moments, she would speak to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him stories about her childhood in Missouri, about the farm she'd grown up on. The words meant not for understanding, but for comfort. Her days became a tightrope walk of deception. She swept away his bloody footprints a dozen times, scattering fresh dust and chicken feed to hide any trace. She burned the blood-soaked rags in her stove at night, the acrid smoke, a constant reminder of her peril. When she worked outside, her ears were constantly strained, listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The hoofbeats she dreaded arrived 4 days after she'd hidden him. Deputy Elias Thorne rode up to her cabin, his horse, a fine, tall bay that stood in stark contrast to Sarah's scrawny mule. Thorne dismounted his movements, deliberate and authoritative. "Mornin', Sarah," he said, his eyes scanning the property, missing nothing. "Just checking in." "Elias," she replied, forcing her hands to stop trembling as she wiped them on her apron. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Posse's still out," he said, getting straight to the point. "That Comanche buck we were chasing vanished into thin air. Led us a real chase down to the Brazos. Figure he must have doubled back. You haven't seen anything unusual?" His gaze was sharp, probing. It lingered on the root cellar door, which Sarah now kept covered with a pile of old sacks. "The only thing unusual I've seen is a posse of grown men failing to catch one injured boy." She said, her tone sharper than she intended. Thorne's jaw tightened. "He wasn't a boy. He was a killer. And he's dangerous. If you see or hear anything, you send a word to me immediately. It's for your own protection." "I've been protecting myself just fine for 2 years, Elias. I don't need you or your posse to do it for me." He stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, frustration perhaps, or a grudging respect. "Just be careful, Sarah," he said, finally turning to mount his horse. "Some secrets ain't worth the keeping." The veiled threat hung in the air long after he was gone. Down in the cellar, the warrior began to heal. The fever broke on the 7th night. Sarah found him awake, his dark eyes clear and lucid for the first time. He was watching her with an unnerving intensity. The suspicion was still there, but it was now tempered with a reluctant curiosity. Communication was a slow, painstaking process of gestures and sounds. He pointed to himself. "Comanche," he said. The name felt strong on his tongue. She pointed to herself. "Sarah." He repeated it, the sound slightly foreign, but recognizable. "Saira." She would bring him food, a thin broth at first, then bread and stew. He ate with a quiet, solemn dignity that seemed at odds with his desperate situation. He watched her constantly studying the way she moved, the way she tended her small garden, the way she mended her clothes by the firelight she allowed herself after dark. One afternoon, she brought down a bowl of water for him to wash. As he painstakingly cleaned himself, she saw the intricate scarring on his arms and back, a map of past battles and rituals she couldn't begin to understand. But she also saw the vulnerability in the new healing wounds she had tended. He was made of flesh and blood, just like Daniel, just like her. He noticed her gaze on his scars. He touched a particularly jagged one on his forearm, then made a gesture like the charge of a buffalo. She understood. A hunt, she in turn showed him a faded daguerreotype of herself and Daniel pointing to the man. She then drew a finger across her own throat and looked down, a universal sign of loss. A flicker of understanding of empathy crossed Comanche's face. He met her eyes and gave a slow, solemn nod. In that shared moment of grief, a fragile bridge was built between their two disparate worlds. He began to regain his strength. He would sit up, testing the pull of the stitches she'd made with horsehair thread. One day, she found him carefully sharpening her small kindling axe against a smooth stone. The sight sent a jolt of fear through her. The weapon was now deadly in his hands. But he simply looked at her, then used the sharpened edge to begin carving a small piece of wood he'd found. For hours he worked in the dim light shavings falling around him. Sarah would sit on the top step of the cellar, watching him, the silence between them no longer awkward, but companionable. The initial fear she'd felt had been replaced by a strange protective bond. She was responsible for this man. His life was in her hands. She knew he couldn't stay forever. His strength was returning, and with it his restlessness. He would stand at the base of the cellar steps, listening to the sounds of the world above his expression, taut with longing. Soon he would have to leave. And Sarah found to her own astonishment that the thought of her impending loneliness was now sharper and more painful than it had ever been before. She had saved a life, but in the process she had opened her own carefully guarded heart to a world of complication she was not prepared for. The day Comanche was well enough to leave arrived with the inevitability of a winter frost. The fierce Texas sun had given way to the cooler, gentler light of early autumn. His wounds had closed, leaving angry red scars that would one day fade to silver. The strength had returned to his limbs, and the restless energy of a caged hawk radiated from him. He conveyed his intent not with words but with actions. One morning, Sarah came down to the cellar to find him standing fully dressed in the mended breeches, his weight steady on both feet. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not a question, but a statement. It was time. A knot of anxiety and a surprising pang of loss tightened in Sarah's chest. The constant nerve-wracking fear of discovery had become a strange kind of companion. His silent presence in the darkness beneath her home had filled a void she hadn't even realized was so vast. "You can't go by day," she said, speaking aloud to herself as much as to him. "Thorn still rides the perimeter. You have to wait for the night. A moonless night." He seemed to understand, giving a single sharp nod. That day was the longest of Sarah's life. A funereal quiet hung over the cabin. They shared a final meal of rabbit stew and cornbread on the cellar steps, the unspoken farewell hanging between them. Comanche ate slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of her face, as if committing it to memory. When he was finished, he held out the small piece of wood he had been carving. It was a hawk feather, exquisitely detailed. Every barb was etched with painstaking precision, the shaft smooth and perfect. It was a thing of simple, profound beauty. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers rough and calloused, brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a surprising warmth through her. He then touched his chest, then gestured to her, and then to the feather. It was a clear, unambiguous message. "This is my debt to you. A part of me for you." Sarah closed her hand around the carving, the wood smooth against her skin. "I don't need payment," she whispered, her voice thick. "I just... be safe." As true darkness fell, cloaking the landscape in shadow, they stood by the back door of the cabin. The night was alive with the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. It was a world he belonged to, and she did not. He paused in the doorway, a tall, powerful silhouette against the starlight. He looked back at her one last time. There was no smile, no grand gesture. There was only a look of profound, solemn gratitude that transcended language. Then he turned and melted into the darkness, as silent and swift as a shadow. Sarah stood listening until the sound of the crickets was the only thing left. The cabin felt cavernously empty. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive. She went back inside, the carved feather clutched in her hand, and for the first time since Daniel's death, she wept. She wept for her loneliness, for the danger she had courted, and for the strange, fleeting connection she had lost. The aftermath of Comanche's departure was a slow, creeping poison. Though he was gone, his ghost remained, and with it, the suspicion of the townsfolk. Deputy Thorne's visits became more frequent, his questions more pointed. "Your well seems to be drawing more water than usual for one person. Sarah," he'd comment. His eyes narrowed. "I've been washing blankets." She'd lie, her heart pounding. "Saw smoke from your chimney late the other night. Cold snap comes early." He'd press. "Couldn't sleep." Her lies were flimsy, and she knew it. The town of Redemption Creek began to turn its back on her in earnest. At the general store, Jebediah Crawford, the portly owner, would serve her, but his usual friendly chatter was replaced by a curt, business-like silence. The other women would stop their conversations when she approached their whispers, following her like biting flies. Then things escalated. One morning, she found one of her chickens with its neck wrung. A week later, someone had thrown a rock through her window in the middle of the night. The worst was when she found a dead rattlesnake coiled on her doorstep, a clear and menacing warning. She knew Thorne was behind it, or at least tacitly encouraging it. He was trying to break her, to frighten her into selling her land and submitting to the town's control. But Sarah Jane Miller was made of sterner stuff than they imagined. Every act of aggression hardened her resolve. This land was hers. Daniel had poured his sweat and blood into it, and she had defended it with a secret that could have seen her hanged. She would not be driven off. She patched her window, buried the chicken, and learned to sleep with the Winchester by her bed. Her isolation became a suit of armor. She stopped going into town unless absolutely necessary, becoming a near hermit on her own property. She talked to her mule to the sky, to the memory of the silent man she had saved. Years began to blur each one, a cycle of planting and harvesting, of scorching summers and mild winters. 2 years passed, then 3. The carved hawk feather, its wood now dark and smooth from her touch, was her only token from that time. She kept it in a small wooden box with her mother's locket and Daniel's wedding ring. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would take it out and hold it, wondering if the man who gave it to her was still alive, if he ever thought of the white woman who had hidden him beneath her floorboards. The memory of Comanche became like a dream, hazy and distant. The immediate brutal reality of her own survival was all-consuming. The wider world, the shifting politics between the settlers and the Comanche nation, were just faint rumbles on a distant horizon. She had no idea that the man she remembered as a wounded fugitive was not only alive, but was forging a legend of his own on the high plains of the Comancheria, or that the debt he felt he owed was far from being settled. While Sarah Jane Miller fought a quiet war of attrition on her small homestead, Comanche was fighting a very different battle. His journey from Miller's Creek was a grueling test of endurance. He traveled by night, subsisting on roots and stolen eggs, his newly healed wounds aching with every step. He moved with a singular purpose to return to his people, the Quahadi band of Comanche, the most fierce and reclusive of all the tribes. He found them camped in the remote vastness of Palo Duro Canyon, a natural fortress of staggering red rock walls. His return was met with a mixture of relief and turmoil. His father, Chief Isatai, a man whose wisdom was as renowned as his prowess in battle, was dying, not from a warrior's wound, but from the white man's coughing sickness that was slowly strangling the life from his people. The tribe was adrift, caught between the old ways and the encroaching new world. Some, led by a charismatic but hot-headed warrior named Nokoni, argued for all-out war, for a final glorious campaign to drive the Tejanos from their lands. Others, the elders, counseled caution, fearing annihilation. Comanche, his body still bearing the marks of his brush with death, saw a third path. His time in Sarah's cellar had changed him. He had seen the settlers not as a monolithic, faceless enemy, but as individuals. He had seen their vulnerability in Sarah's loneliness, their tenacity in her small, defiant farm. He had also seen their numbers and their relentless determination. A war fought on their terms, he knew, was a war the Comanche could not win. His father, in his last days, saw this new wisdom in his son's eyes. The hawk sees the world from above. The old chief rasped his voice, thin as a dry leaf. It sees the snake in the grass and the rabbit in the thicket. You have seen the white man's world from the inside, my son. Use that sight. Lead our people not with the blind fury of the bear, but with the cunning of the hawk. Upon his father's death, the leadership of the Quahadi was contested. Nokone, with his fiery speeches and promises of victory, held the support of the younger warriors. Comanche, quieter and more thoughtful, had to earn his place. He did it not with boasts, but with results. Remembering the settlers' predictable patrol routes he'd observed from Sarah's property, he led a small raiding party that slipped past the Texas Rangers, retrieving a herd of stolen Comanche horses without losing a single man. While Nokone advocated for bloody skirmishes, Comanche focused on sustenance. He organized a great buffalo hunt, using a strategy of flanking and driving the herd that he'd devised after watching settlers manage their cattle. The hunt was a massive success, providing enough meat and hides to see the tribe through a harsh winter. He taught his warriors to fight smarter, not just harder. He understood the power of the repeating rifle and the telegraph wire. He knew the enemy's strengths and weaknesses because he had lived for a brief time under their very roof. Slowly, methodically, the tribe began to see the wisdom in his leadership. He was not less of a warrior than Nokone. He was more. He was a strategist, a survivor. One by one, the clan leaders and elders pledged their loyalty. Comanche, the fugitive who had nearly died in a muddy creek, became the new war chief of the Quahadi Comanche. But his new responsibilities weighed heavily on him. He sat in councils negotiated with other bands and led his warriors, but his thoughts often drifted eastward back to a small sod cabin and a woman with weary but defiant blue eyes. The memory of her kindness was a constant, unsettling presence. In his world, debts were matters of profound honor. A life saved was a life owed. He had left her a token, a promise, but it felt insufficient. He had seen the way the other settlers treated her, the suspicion in their eyes. He knew with a warrior's intuition that her act of mercy had likely cost her dearly. The small carved feather he had made was a symbol of his spirit, but the debt demanded more. It demanded an action as bold and world-altering as the one she had taken for him. While he fought to save his people from one world, he could not forget the woman who had bridged the gap between two. 4 years after he had vanished into the Texas night, the situation on the frontier reached a breaking point. The U.S., Army under commanders like Ranald S. Mackenzie, was launching a new relentless campaign to force the last free bands onto reservations. Treaties were broken, and the buffalo, the lifeblood of the Plains tribes, were being slaughtered by the thousand. A great council of the Comanche bands was called. The mood was grim. War seemed inevitable, a final, desperate struggle for survival. Nokone and his faction bayed for blood. The elders feared it would be the end of their people. It was then that Comanche, chief of the Quahadi, stood before the council fire. He was no longer the wounded boy who had collapsed at Sarah's feet. He was a man in his prime, his presence commanding his face, a mask of resolute purpose. The firelight played across the scars she had tended. He spoke not of war, but of strength. He spoke not of hate, but of honor. The Tejanos break their word, he said, his voice ringing through the canyon. They kill the buffalo and steal our land. To fight them with arrows against cannons is to die. But to surrender is to die a slower death. We must show them a strength they do not understand. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled chiefs and warriors. 4 winters ago I lay dying. A white woman, a Tejano, saved my life. She hid me from the hunters and healed my wounds. She did this knowing it could mean her own death. This is a debt of blood, a debt of honor. I will not let it stand unpaid. A murmur went through the crowd. Nokoni scoffed openly. You speak of a white woman, while our people face extinction. Her people are the ones who put you in that creek. Comanche turned his gaze on Nokoni, his eyes as cold and hard as flint. She showed a courage that many warriors lack. She chose honor over the laws of her tribe. I will do the same. He raised his voice, silencing all dissent. I will ride to the white man's town. I will not go to war. I will go to collect my debt. Before their council and ours, I will make a claim that will bind our worlds. The woman who saved my life, I will claim her as my wife. Her bravery will become our bravery. Her strength will be a bridge. Let the white men see that a Comanche chief honors his debts even to one of their own. Let them see a bond stronger than any of their worthless paper treaties. The council was stunned into silence. It was an audacious, unthinkable plan. To take a white woman not as a captive, but as a chief's bride before the tribe. It was a move of such radical political and personal significance that no one knew how to react. It was a challenge, a statement, and a promise all in one. The hawk was about to make a stoop that would shake the very foundations of both their worlds. The arrival of the Comanche delegation at Redemption Creek was not an act of war, but it felt like one. Comanche rode at the head of 20 of his best warriors. They were not in war paint, but they were armed and sat astride their painted ponies with an unnerving stillness that was more intimidating than any war cry. They stopped at the edge of the town, a silent, formidable line, causing panic to ripple through the dusty streets. Shutters were bolted, doors were barred. Men grabbed their rifles. Deputy Elias Thorne, his face pale but set with grim determination, strode into the middle of the street, flanked by a dozen hastily deputized townsmen. State your business, Chief. Thorne called out his hand, hovering over the colt at his hip. He recognized Comanche. Reports of the formidable new Quahadi chief had circulated for years, but seeing him in person, seeing the warrior he'd hunted, now a leader of nations, was a shock. Comanche dismounted, his movements fluid and confident. He held up an empty hand, a sign of peace. I do not come for blood, Deputy. I came to settle a debt. There is a woman here. Sarah Jane Miller. The mention of her name sent a jolt through Thorne and the assembled men. Whispers broke out. Thorne's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What business do you have with her? My business is with her, and it is a matter of honor. Comanche replied, his English better than Thorne expected, honed through interactions with traders and captives over the years. Bring her. The demand was not a request. Thorne hesitated, his mind racing. A shootout here would be a massacre for the town, but to simply acquiesce to a Comanche chief's demand felt like a surrender. He sent one of his men, a young man named Billy, to fetch Sarah. Sarah was in her yard, feeding her chickens, when Billy rode up his horse, lathered, and his face white with fear. Sarah, you gotta come to town. Now. Deputy's orders. What is it, Billy? She asked, a familiar dread coiling in her stomach. It's Indians, a whole war party. Their chief is asking for you. By name. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Their chief. It couldn't be. After 4 years of silence, of struggle, of fading memories, it was impossible. She grabbed her shawl, her hands shaking, and mounted her mule, her mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. When she reached the edge of town, the scene that greeted her stole her breath. There, sitting on his war pony, was Comanche. He was no longer the gaunt, bleeding man from her root cellar. He was broader, stronger, his face radiating an authority that was absolute. He wore a magnificent eagle feather headdress, and his buckskin shirt was adorned with intricate beadwork. The scars she had tended were visible on his arms, but his eyes, when they met hers across the dusty street, were the same. They held the same intensity, the same fire, but now they also held a possessive, unwavering certainty that rooted her to the spot. He dismounted and walked towards her, his warriors parting to let him pass. The townsmen held their rifles tighter. Sarah felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, the fearful, accusing eyes of her neighbors, and the curious, stoic eyes of the Comanche. She slid off her mule, her legs unsteady. She stood before him, a plain woman in a faded calico dress, facing a king in his own right. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, but carrying in the tense silence. He had spoken her name. Comanche. She breathed the name of a ghost on her tongue. "You gave me my life," he said, his voice resonating with formal gravity. "The debt is heavy. I have come to pay for it." He turned not just to her, but to everyone, assembled his warriors, Thorn the entire town of Redemption Creek. His voice rose, a proclamation meant for all to hear. "A life for a life. She saved mine. Now I will save hers from this prison of dust and whispers." He looked directly at Thorn, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "You shunned her for her mercy. You made her an outcast for her honor. In my tribe, such a woman is a queen." He turned back to Sarah, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "I am chief of the Quahadi now. My home is vast. My people are strong. Your life here is small and hard. I claim the right to settle this debt. I claim you, Sarah Jane Miller, as my wife. You will be the bride of the chief. You will have honor. You will have protection. You will never be alone again." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorn's face went from pale to a deep, apoplectic red. This was an insult, beyond measure a brazen challenge. To the Comanche it was a declaration of unimaginable honor paid to a white woman. To the settlers it was an abduction, thinly veiled as a proposal. Sarah's mind reeled. Wife his bride. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He wasn't asking, he was declaring. This wasn't a private proposal, it was a public political act, performed on a stage of simmering hatred. He was using his debt to her, as a tool, a weapon, a bridge, she wasn't sure which. "You can't do this," Thorn snarled, taking a step forward. "She is one of us." Comanche didn't even look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Sarah. "She has not been one of you for a long time. You saw that? The choice is hers. But if she refuses, the debt remains. And I will find another way to pay for it." The unspoken threat was clear refuse this peaceful claim, and a more violent one might follow. Sarah looked from Comanche's intense, waiting face to the furious, hateful faces of the townspeople who had made her life a misery. They had never wanted her, not really. They had wanted her to conform, to break, to be what they expected a lone widow to be. She looked at her calloused hands, her worn-out dress, her small, lonely cabin on the horizon. It was a life of bare survival, not of living. Comanche was offering her an escape, but it was an escape into a world she could not possibly imagine, a world of danger, of foreign customs, a world that her own people considered savage. Yet in his eyes she saw a promise, not of love, not of ease, but of respect. He saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person whose worth he was declaring before the entire world. She took a deep breath, the dust of Redemption Creek filling her lungs one last time. She looked Elias Thorne dead in the eye, a small defiant smile touching her lips. Then she turned back to the Comanche chief. "All right," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing across the silent street. "I will go with you." Her decision landed like a thunderclap. Comanche's stoic expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of relief, of triumph in his eyes. He gestured to one of his warriors who brought forward a beautiful pinto mare with a decorated saddle. As Sarah moved to mount the horse, leaving her old mule behind, she heard the whispers turn to shouts of "traitor resemblance" and "savage lover." Elias Thorne looked at her as if she had just signed her own death warrant, his face a mask of pure loathing. She did not look back. She rode beside Comanche away from Redemption Creek, leaving her old life burning in a pyre of broken allegiances and shattered expectations. She was terrified, uncertain, and completely unmoored from everything she had ever known. But for the first time in 4 years, she was not alone. She was riding into a new world claimed by a man whose life she had saved to face a council far more daunting than the gossip of a small Texas town. The journey to the Quahadi encampment in Palo Duro Canyon was a disorienting plunge into another existence. The world Sarah had known, of fences, straight-ploughed furrows, and the tolling of a church bell dissolved behind her. Ahead lay a seemingly endless ocean of grass, under a sky so vast it felt like a physical weight. The Comanche warriors treated her with a guarded, formal distance. They were not unkind, but she was an alien presence, a puzzle they had not yet solved. She rode beside Comanche, the silence between them, thick with unspoken questions. He seemed to sense her unease, occasionally pointing out landmarks, a lone mesa that looked like a sleeping giant, a hidden spring, a herd of antelope, flowing like water across the plains. It was his way of showing her the fabric of his world, a world not of ownership, but of connection to the land itself. Their arrival in the canyon was overwhelming. The encampment was a sprawling city of hide lodges, smoke spiraling from their peaks into the crisp air. Hundreds of people, dogs and horses, filled the canyon floor with a vibrant, chaotic energy. The smell of wood smoke, roasting meat and tanned leather was intoxicating. As she rode in beside the chief, a hush fell over the camp. Every eye was on her. She saw curiosity, hostility, and outright disbelief in the faces that watched her pass. She was the white woman the Tejano brought, not as a captive to be scorned or a slave to be worked, but as the chosen bride of their formidable leader. Comanche led her to a large teepee set slightly apart from the others. "This will be our lodge," he said simply. Inside, buffalo robes were piled high for warmth, and a small fire pit sat in the center. It was sparse but clean. An older woman with a severe face and knowing eyes entered, placing a bowl of water and some dried meat before Sarah. "This is my mother's sister Tave," Comanche explained. "She will show you our ways." Tave looked at Sarah with an expression that was neither friendly nor unfriendly. It was pure, unadulterated judgment. The true test came that evening. A great fire was lit in the center of the camp, and the council of elders and clan leaders convened. Comanche led Sarah before them. She stood in her plain calico dress, a pale, fragile-looking figure in a circle of powerful men whose faces were maps of wisdom and war. Nokoni Comanche's rival was the first to speak, his voice dripping with contempt. "Our chief brings a sickness into our camp. He brings a white woman to his lodge, while her people kill our brothers and starve our children. What strength is there in this? This is a weakness. She will soften him. She will fill his head with her people's poison." A murmur of agreement ran through some of the warriors. Comanche stood impassive, letting the descent wash over him. Then he spoke, his voice calm but resonant with power. "I have not brought a weakness. I have brought a symbol of honor. The law of our people is that a debt of life is the highest debt. This woman," he said, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gesture of possession and protection, "paid my debt before I even asked. She risked the hatred of her own tribe to save one of ours. Is that not the heart of a Comanche?" He looked at the elders. "Her people are relentless. They are a flood. We cannot stop a flood by standing in the river. We must be clever. We must find higher ground. This union is a message. It says we value honor above the color of skin. It shows a strength they cannot understand and will not expect." But the council was not convinced. An old, respected elder named Wounded Bear spoke, his voice like stones grinding together. "A symbol is one thing, Chief. A wife is another. Can she tan a hide? Can she sew a lodge? Can she raise strong Comanche sons? She is not one of us. She will always be an outsider." All eyes turned to Sarah. This was her moment, her trial by fire. Her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't speak their language, couldn't defend herself with words. She had to use another language. Remembering the poultices she'd made for Comanche, she stepped forward. She knelt, and using a stick, drew a shape in the dirt. It was the jagged star-like leaf of the yarrow plant. She then pointed to a warrior in the circle who had a fresh, festering cut on his arm. She looked at Tave, the old woman, and made a gesture of grinding and mixing, then pointed to the wound again. Tave stared at her. Then a flicker of understanding crossed her face. She grunted and nodded towards a pouch on her own belt. Sarah, emboldened, continued. She drew the broad leaf of the comfrey plant, the knit bone of her grandmother's lore, and pantomimed a broken bone being set and healed. A new murmur went through the council. This was a language they understood. She was not just a helpless white woman. She possessed knowledge. She was a healer. Comanche watched her, a gleam of pride in his eyes. He had known she possessed this skill, but he had let her demonstrate it herself. He had given her the chance to prove her own worth. She then stood up, her fear transmuting into a cold resolve. She looked directly at Nokone, the man who had called her a sickness. She could not match his words, but she could match his defiance. She held his gaze without flinching, her chin held high. In her blue eyes, there was no plea for acceptance, only a statement of fact. I am here. I am not afraid. The gesture was not lost on the council. They saw not a timid captive, but a woman of formidable spirit, a woman who had faced down Elias Thorne and was now facing down one of their own fiercest warriors. Wounded Bear, the elder, looked from Sarah to Comanche. He was silent for a long time, stroking his chin. Finally, he gave a slow nod. The chief's choice is a strange one. The path he has chosen is clouded. But the woman has spirit. She has knowledge. She is not empty. Let the union stand. Let us see what fruit this strange tree bears. The council was concluded. It was not a victory, but a reprieve. Sarah had earned not their acceptance, but a chance to prove herself. Later that night, in the quiet of their lodge, Comanche sat across the small fire from her. "You were brave tonight," he said. "I didn't have much choice," she replied, her voice raspy. "There is always a choice," he countered. "You chose to stand. You did not choose to break." He then reached into a leather pouch and pulled out an object. It was the carved hawk feather she had kept for 4 years. "My warrior found this in your cabin," he said, explaining how he had sent a scout to watch her and ensure she was safe before he came. You kept it. She nodded, unable to speak. He had been watching over her. It is the mark of my spirit, he said, placing it in her hand. Now it is home. In that moment, sitting in a teepee, deep in the heart of the Comanche, a world away from everything she had ever known, Sarah Jane Miller felt a strange and powerful sense of belonging. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. She was still an outsider, but she was no longer alone. She was the chief's bride, a woman of two worlds, bound by a debt of honor that had blossomed into a fragile, tenacious destiny. Sarah's life in the Quahati camp was a daily lesson in humility and resilience. Under the stern, watchful eye of Tave, she was plunged into a new existence. She learned the rhythms of a Comanche woman's life, her days filled with tasks that were both exhausting and vital. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, grew tougher as she learned to scrape and tan buffalo hides, sew with an awl and sinew, and identify the life-giving roots and berries of the plains. She failed, often earning quiet smirks from the other women, but her persistence did not go unnoticed. They saw the chief's white woman did not shy away from the hardest work, and a grudging respect began to grow. Her true value, however, was revealed through her knowledge of herbs. When a child broke his arm, the tribe's medicine man set the bone, but it was Sarah who made a comfrey poultice to speed the healing. This skill became her own language, a bridge of care that transcended words and suspicion, solidifying her place within the tribe. Her relationship with Comanche was a slow, cautious unfolding. As a chief, his days were consumed by the immense pressure of leadership. But in the quiet of their lodge at night, they built a world of their own. They taught each other their languages, his tongue struggling with the soft sounds of English, hers with the guttural clicks of Comanche. They shared stories of their pasts, creating a tapestry of shared understanding. One evening, he reached into a leather pouch and presented her with the carved hawk feather she had kept for 4 years. A scout sent to watch over her before his arrival had retrieved it. You kept it. He stated a world of meaning in those simple words. Always, she replied. It is the mark of my spirit, he said, placing it back in her hand. Now it is home. In that moment, their union born of debt and politics began to feel like a true partnership. But the world outside their canyon would not grant them peace. Elias Thorne, humiliated and enraged, used Sarah's defection to whip up anti-Comanche sentiment to a fever pitch, petitioning the army at Fort Sill to intervene. Within the tribe, Noconi seized upon the news. Your white wife has brought the blue coats to our doorstep, he raged in council. Your bridge is a path for their soldiers. Comanche remained steadfast. They have always been coming, Noconi, but now we have a story to tell them. The confrontation arrived with a column of cavalry guided by Thorne himself. War seemed certain, but Comanche's strategy was not a frontal assault. He rode out to meet the patrol with a small delegation. At his side, mounted on her pinto mare and wearing a buckskin dress Tave had helped her make, was Sarah. The soldiers, expecting a savage ambush, were stunned to see a white woman riding freely beside the chief. Sarah, we've come to rescue you, the army captain, a man named Benteen, called out. Thorne pointed a trembling finger. She's a captive. Tell them what he's done to you. It was Sarah who answered, her voice clear and strong. I am not a captive, Elias. I am home. She looked directly at Captain Benteen. I came with my husband by my own choice. The Comanche have treated me with more honor than I ever received in Redemption Creek. Benteen was taken aback. This was not the simple rescue mission he had been sold. An armed conflict to save a woman who claimed she needed no saving was a political hornet's nest. Comanche seized the moment. "My wife is a bridge between our peoples. If you want peace, we can speak of it. If you want war, we will give it to you. But know that you will be firing on a camp that is home to one of your own." He had brilliantly turned the settlers' own values against them. Captain Bentin, a practical man, made his decision. He gave a curt order, and the column of soldiers turned back, leaving Thorn sputtering in impotent rage. As the soldiers retreated, Comanche looked at Sarah, and for the first time she saw him truly smile. It transformed his stern face, and in that shared look she understood. Their union was no longer just a personal bond. It was a shield, a new kind of weapon in a war that couldn't be won with arrows alone. Their future was uncertain, but they would face it together, their shared story a testament to a debt of honor that had become a bridge of feathers and steel. The story of Sarah and Comanche is more than just a tale of the Old West. It's a powerful reminder that the deepest connections are often forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Their journey teaches us about the true meaning of honor, the courage it takes to defy prejudice, and the incredible strength that can be found when two different worlds dare to meet, not with violence, but with understanding. It's a testament to the fact that a single act of compassion can ripple through history, changing the course of lives and challenging the hatred of an entire generation. Theirs is a legacy not of conquest, but of connection, a fragile bridge built of mercy and respect, proving that even in the harshest of landscapes, humanity can find a way to bloom. If their story moved, you please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who appreciates tales of courage and unlikely love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true life dramas from the annals of history. What part of Sarah and Comanche's journey resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.